patients come to me in my practice and they, feel alienated from the religious upbringing of their childhood. But they're longing. They are longing to have some kind of spiritual experience in their lives. Because just as you said, there's like a kind of sickness when it's missing, when the sacred aspect is missing.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. I, as many of you know, have riffed at length about this idea that I broadly refer to as soul sickness. Basically, that this modern mental health malaise, and that really doesn't do it justice, cataclysm, really, when you look at the numbers. Call me a kook, but I think we're dealing with more than neurochemistry gone awry. I think we're dealing with more than some broken brain bits. I mean, we are living in a world that psychospiritually insults us. We are psychically parched. Our souls are thirsty for something. Of course, I am far from the first to recognize this, to posit this. The great psychospiritual genius psychiatrist Carl Jung did, James Hillman did, many more have, many guests that I've had on the show have, in fact. But be that as it may, this soul sickness phenomenon certainly is not slowing down. So when I heard about psychiatrist Dr. Judy Tsafrir, a psychiatrist who has really transformed her own psyche and also her practice into this multidimensional, soul-facing endeavor, I was like, yes, absolutely, she must be in the mind meld. Dr. Judy Tsafrir is a Harvard-educated psychiatrist. She's actually still on the faculty at Harvard Medical, so obviously she is traditionally rigorously educated. But what makes her really rare is, in addition to that, she also had something of a spiritual awakening. And as such, she brings the unconscious, the archetypal, and the mystical into her practice in a very deep way. She even does guided psychedelic medicine therapy. She's also got a book out called Sacred Psychiatry. All the links that you're going to need for that and Judy in general are in the description. Same for Third Eye Drops. And on the note of this media vessel, my friends, I'm doing my best week in and week out to keep grinding these episodes to the platforms for you. But of course I love it. Of course I love you. All I ask in return is for a little love back in the form of booping that algorithm with a like, a sub, a comment, a share. Truly, truly appreciate it. We got to keep that ever-hungry algorithm golem fed. Do sub to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to podcasts, because we've got hundreds of audio-only pods with brilliant beings that are never going to be up here on YouTube. And if you want to go deeper, you want to support more directly, chat with me on Discord and Zoom along with hundreds of other Wonder Dippers, get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more, join a book club, hop in to our Wonder Lodge over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. I would love to riff with you there. And speaking of riffing, let's do so with Dr. Judy Tsafrir. Judy, I am so excited to have you in the mind meld. I feel like a fun way to start might be talking about the way, the sort of synchronistic way in which we collided together. Because as we were just saying before we were recording, it's always you always know maybe you should pay attention when a little synchronicity unfolds, especially in a case like this. So, first of all, welcome, and second of all, I would love for you to recount the story for people.
Okay, so I was being interviewed by Molly Adler on her podcast Back from the Borderline, and she, well, I don't know, maybe she said it to me in an email that she really wanted me to meet her friend Michael, that she felt like we would really resonate with each other. And so after the interview, as like a follow-up, I wanted to send her some podcasts that had meaning to me. So I sent her a podcast that, unbeknownst to me, was that you were the Michael she was referring to, and it was your podcast and you interviewing Rick Tarnas.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we were also talking a little bit. You know, we have this idea of what is valuable information, right? Like, can this information be verified? Can this information be measured? And that's how we determine the meaning, right? Like how many times can we reproduce this? How much can we isolate this and prove it to be true? And I know and you know that's very valuable. However, it also does not account for things like what you just described. And for me to write off little winks from the whatever, the mysterium tremendum like that, I just can't do it. I just can't do it.
Well, it doesn't even seem like it would be a good plan to do so.
No, no. And yet, as I was also saying before we were recording, that's one of my favorite things about people like you is that you are a rare example of someone who has gone through very, very rigorous educational and vocational training as a psychiatrist at a very prestigious university, but then there's still something more. There's still something that doesn't feel quite satisfied, like it sufficiently explains the human condition, that is a completely different kind of knowing. And synchronicities are just one example of this. So I would love to just hear the story a bit, about how you began to cross that chasm, how you began to reach for something more than the kind of standard, Western medical and psychological POV that is popularly taught.
Well, I think I have to go back to my childhood, um, and the influence of my father, who was also a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst like me. But he was also a person who had um, a lot of feel for the mystical, and he
Hmm.
was very interested in astrology. And he kept it a secret because he was afraid for his reputation professionally. He was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Pittsburgh. And so it was something that I was familiar with from growing up. And I also went with him to see mediums and
Oh
psychics.
wow.
So, like, that was already something that I had as an example, um, that there is more than what is like conventionally accepted in terms of science, and the scientific materialist point of view. Um, and also, like, I myself, when I was like a teenager, I read all the books by Carlos Castaneda,
Oh yeah, yeah.
which is about shamanism. And I was interested in consciousness, and I started. It was it was that time. It was the early '70s. I learned transcendental meditation, so I
Oh
started
really?
meditating when I was 15. But that was kind of the era, and it was
Yeah,
also the
yeah,
era
yeah.
of like psychedelics.
Hmm.
Um, so I feel like even though I have had like a rigorous conventional training as a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, I already had kind of an openness from my family growing up and from the times that I grew up in. Um, but I practiced as a fairly conventional psychoanalyst, until I was in my late 40s. I had a practice of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. I never was that much into prescribing medications, though I did. And then when I was 49, both my parents died within 3 months of each other.
Wow.
And my marriage ended, and I had three little children. And so I was just sort of like this confluence of losses prompted me to get a consultation for the first time with a professional astrologer. And I was so fascinated by my conversation with her that I went back to see her repeatedly to look at the horoscopes of all the important people in my life until after, I don't know, a year and a half or 2 years, I decided I would like to learn to do this myself. And so I apprenticed myself to a well known astrologer, Stephen Forrest, and studied with him for a while, and then went on to study with a second well known astrologer, Maurice Fernandez. And that was kind of the gateway that opened me up to studying shamanism, studying energy medicine, studying functional medicine, which is, really pretty 3D, but has to
Yeah.
do with looking for root causes of illness in the body. Um, so I just started adding all of these holistic modalities to my practice. And it changed me as well because I became kind of more um, interested in kind of spiritualizing my life. And so that's kind of how it all began.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of those subjects that even I am careful about how I approach. And I mean, the stigma around astrology is totally understood. Like I again briefly told you before we recorded that I had like a critical mind even as a young person. I was always questioning, how can people believe this? Why would they worship that? Why would they think that this is the case? And on the face of it, something like astrology seems incredibly subjective, open to interpretation, cold reading, all these criticisms that people levy upon it. However, when you encounter people like, those people we mutually admire, like Rick Tarnas, I've also become friends with Lawrence Hillman, James Hillman's son, um, and he's been a lifelong astrologer. And you start to realize that there's this kind of literacy underneath the kind of knowledge that they have, where it's like this psycho spiritual symbolic literacy that is objectively part of the grammar of how the human psyche operates. But then I guess the real red pill moment is when you can no longer deny that it's not just in the confines of your brain and of your personal psyche. It seems to extend out into the world. And in a sense, once again, I get from the critical minded POV why that's a bridge too far for some people. But also, I think people at the same time, almost everyone has any kind of spiritual openness, even agnosticism is the thing that seems to unite anybody who's not completely dismissive of everything, is that we're all connected in some way. We're all connected. And it's like, well, what does that mean? And when you start looking to the world's religious traditions, whether it's Eastern, whether it's Western, whether it's Native, they all seem to agree that there is this spirit, this anima mundi. I'm a huge fan of the Greek way of looking at all of this, so that's the first thing that comes to my mind. But some kind of animating substance and principle and soul that underpins everything that we are participating in, that we're not like discrete causes of, that we are swimming in. The whole analogy of like consciousness or spirit or soul or whatever is like the fish not knowing that it's swimming in the water, right? And if you're open to that, I mean, that, like, those two things combined, the sort of notion of archetypes and this symbolic way of seeing that extends beyond the border of the personal psyche. And it's like, well, wait a minute, this sounds exactly like what astrology is proposing, that we live in this network of archetypal forces that maybe it's not clear how they're influencing, or maybe it's not clear through, what the mechanisms are. But when you speak to a truly educated person on the topic, like yourself, like Richard Tarnas, like Lawrence Hillman, and so many others, the straw manning, the newspaper, sun signing sort of like hand wavy stuff, you at the very least have to admit that this is a much deeper well than people who so conveniently straw man it would uh would have you believe.
There's an astrologer who I like named Emily Trinkus, and
Hmm.
she says astrology is an apprenticeship to the mystery. Because
Hmm.
once you witness the correlations between the positions of the planets and events on Earth and people's lives and their personalities and their strengths and their weaknesses, you just can't deny that it's real. And then if that's real, like, oh my God, how can that be? Well, you have no idea, you know? Like, how could that possibly work? You don't understand it, but you see that it does.
Right. Right. Yeah, I'm curious what some moments for you that were just undeniable were. Like, was there something in that initial reading you talked about that just kind of pulled, like, the scales fell from your eyes and you were like, okay, this is real, or was it gradual, or how did that happen?
I think it was I think it was gradual, just learning more and more. And the more I learned, the more um, amazing it was. But I mean, sometimes there are events that just kind of blow your mind. Like you can't believe that this is what's going on in the sky and this is what's going on in your life. It's so
Right.
literal.
And this is something that I'm still slowly absorbing, and you sort of feel like at a certain point, kind of like you, when you had this moment of thinking, I got to study this, I got to learn this for myself. I'm interested in doing that for astrology, but not just astrology, because you realize that it is part of this lineage, this sort of like broadly Western esoteric lineage, and there's so much overlap between psychology, philosophy, mythology, and all of these things, that there is this underlying, like I said before, the symbolic grammar, the symbolic mythopoetic literacy, and this multimodal thinking where the creativity of the individual interpreter really becomes part of how not just accurate it is, but the levels of wisdom that you're able to pull out of it. Because somebody who, once again, to use Lawrence Hillman as an example, because he has this back, this, for people that don't know, very famous father, James Hillman, who's this mythopoetic master, sort of post Jungian, and founder of archetypal psychology. He's got that, and then he's also got this lifetime of astrological experience, and that enables him to just, as soon as he sees something, like, he can tell a story, and he can tell a very relevant story based on the archetypes and their relationships with one another. And I think at the very least, when someone's able to do that, you've got to admit that it's an a portal opens for you to see things about yourself and about your life that are both subjectively and objectively real. And it's kind of hard to explain it if people haven't experienced it, but it is like, it's surreal and psychedelic. I mean, like, Lawrence was kind enough to do the only natal reading I've ever had by a professional astrologer. And when he did it, it felt very psychedelic to me. It felt very like, whoa, this person is looking under a hood that I didn't know that I had, or something, like they're looking at these parts that feel incredibly private in some cases, and just nailing it time and time again. And that's a crazy
It's
feeling.
astonishing, right? It's
Yeah,
like mind blowing.
it really is. Yeah, it really is. um I'm curious, so you said you came up doing a lot of psychoanalysis, and I know now you have a great appreciation for Jung, from what I've gleaned. But was that always a part of the way you approach psychoanalysis, or was he one of these people who sort of was on the border of acceptable and unacceptable? Because that's
Well,
the
I mean,
sense
he
that
was
I
not
have.
part of my training. Like, I
Okay.
trained at a very conventional psychoanalytic institute, and we didn't have any classes in Jung.
Hmm. Wow.
Um, and I've just kind of absorbed it. I have not really studied Jung, um, but I think that I kind of naturally resonate with him. Um, like traditional psychoanalysis is really allergic to anything that is spiritual. Like Freud had an idea that some kind of sense of the numinous or um, something greater than ourselves was some kind of infantile wish.
Hmm.
The oceanic. It was not. It was not. It was sort of delusional. Like and the aspiration was to um, be kind of accepting of normal human misery rather than um, expecting that we could have something more than that, instead of like neurotic suffering.
Yeah. Yeah. Freud is one of those thinkers that I need to admittedly do a deeper dive into, because there's always this. I mean, especially for people who are into Jung, there's this sense that he was the one who was trying to, like, boil everything down to sex functions, and dreams were just unfulfilled daily wishes. And but I know enough to know that these are all things that are, again, kind of straw manning the depth of his wisdom and his approach. And I read some about how toward the end of life he was getting very into exploring the death archetype and the Thanatos, um, you know, God, quote unquote, from Greek thought. And I get a sense that he is a much deeper thinker than, and clearly he's a very deep thinker, but even mythopoetically and spiritually deep than than a lot of people who are more warm to Jung give him credit for. But that's something I need to do more research on myself, I think.
Well, he wanted to be accepted,
Right.
like,
Right.
and so he wanted Jung to be like the face of psychoanalysis. He was like the pastor's son.
Right.
And but then when Jung started talking about archetypes and all this spiritual stuff, then Freud was made very anxious, like, because he wanted it to be scientific.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and how funny is that I never thought about that, but maybe there's something going on in Jung's chart in that respect, because he was literally the son of a pastor, and then he was also like the protege of another very um almost religiously significant figure, like Freud. Um and that took some kind of massive upheaval to overturn that. I I don't know what age he was when he had that famous schism with Freud, that eventually spawned the Red Book and everything. But that would be another thing that would be really interesting to look at astrologically. Like, was there some kind of major, like, return occurring, or
Right,
something like
right.
that? Yeah.
But Jung would never see a patient, as far as I've understood, without looking at their astrological chart. Like, he really integrated it very much so into his practice.
Yeah, yeah, and I know that was something I think that made Freud uncomfortable. I remember there was a fairly famous piece of correspondence, where Jung was saying that his evenings were really being consumed by studying astrology, and he just kept finding synchronicities. And from my understanding, that's what he kind of chalked it up to, is that these correspondences, they can't be measured because they're operating on the same rule set as a synchronicity is. Like, that whatever causes synchronicities to occur, there are like these same um sort of trans physical, trans psychological, psychophysical um uniting principle or substance underneath all of that we don't normally have access to, like this psychoid um, thing happening, as he referred to it. And I don't know if we'll ever be able to fully answer the question. I think there has been some interesting progress made on trying to figure out what synchronicity is, and what the best words to describe it are. But I fundamentally think that it's not. I just don't think it's ever going to be measurable unless we develop some completely new kind of science that blends the sort of like subjective um sense of conscious, well, not even just sense of consciousness, but actual consciousness itself with the empirical. I don't know if we'll ever be able to.
For myself, like, I don't even feel like that compelled by the question, like, how does it work? Like, I
Mhm.
don't really care. Like, for me, it's enough that I observe that it does. I just kind of accept it.
Yeah. And I think that's so important too. Speaking to that kind of is a nice segue into one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, which is the power of ritual. And this is something you discuss in your book, which I was able to blast through most of it. We only connected about a week ago, so we turned this around pretty quickly. But I did get through a good amount of it, and I love that you spend a decent amount of time talking about the importance of ritual and how to actually begin a ritual practice. Because once again, these are the benefits that come from ritual are not these things we can measure. They're not things that even make sense a lot of the time. And I could go on, but I want to hear um, why you think it's so important, and then also I'd love to get into sort of some basics of, if people are feeling like they're missing that dimension to their life, how they can start to do simple things to spin that up in their life.
So, in my book, the first chapter is called Reclaiming a Multidimensional Sense of the Self. And it's the longest chapter, and it's like the heart of the book. And in it, I describe all kinds of different practices that a person can engage in order to spiritualize their life and to help them develop a sense of feeling connected to something larger than themselves. And ritual is one of those practices that I guess, and I guess it's magical. Like, we can't say how it works or why it works, but it's something that you participate in that creates a feeling of enchantment.
Yeah.
So, for instance, um, there was just a new moon yesterday in Gemini. And like, a practice that somebody could do in terms of ritual would be to, with new moons, that's the archetypal significance is like a seed planting. It's like a beginning.
Mm.
It's the beginning of the new cycle of the zodiac. So it was a new moon in Gemini, and new moon is when the sun and the moon come together. And full moon is when they're 180 degrees opposite one another. So for new moons, you can set intentions and seed plantings. And for full moons, that's like a time of like releasing something.
Mm.
So you could take the archetypal significance of Gemini, which has to do with, it's ruled by Mercury, and it has to do with the way that you think about things, the way that you communicate, the way that you write. It's about learning, it's about information. And so um, you could set an intention with the new moon that you would like to spend time writing every day. And you could use the support of that archetypal energy of Gemini to fuel that ritual intention. And you could take some flax seeds or some sesame seeds, and you could make an offering with them to do something like concrete.
Yeah.
Or you could, write these things down. There's just so many different kinds of rituals that can be done that feel supportive and grounding. Like, I like to use a drum, and I like to drum in the morning, and I like to pray with a drum, and that's like a ritual. Like you can like give thanks for the blessing of being given another day. You can ask for courage. You can anticipate what you're going to be doing that day and ask for blessing and guidance. I mean, in my book, I describe many, many different kinds of rituals. I don't know. Did that answer your question? Or
Yeah. It's a great start. Yeah. And it's the other thing that really strikes me about it is it's an example of how you bring this other way of knowing and being that is not this empirical frontal lobe dominated way of interfacing with the world, where you are not fixating on pieces of external dopamine based ways of interaction, or doing tasks that you're crossing off a list just for the sake of obligation, or your job, or whatever it is. It's this way of being that's more basic. It is inherently restful. It is inherently puts you in a mode of being that's in a larger context. I mean, even
it's
if you're
expansive.
yes, it's expansive. And I mean, this is even true if you're an atheist and you're allergic to all of this stuff and you somehow made it to 30 minutes of this conversation. You can just light incense and sit there and do breathing techniques that are going to put your nervous system in a calmer state, and see how it changes your mind, and over time has this kind of cumulative effect. I was just talking to a good friend of mine who's an author, and meditation has just been a huge part of his practice. um, and we were talking about this cumulative effect that comes from something like ritual, and especially meditation. And I think you might even touch on this in the book a little bit, that the brain itself changes over time. The nervous system changes over time. Your breathing patterns change over time. And when you exist in that way of being, your perception of reality changes in so many ways that are not hypothetical or subjective. I mean, they're subjective because you're participating in them, but they're but they're also objective in that it really does change who you are, and it gives you the ability to live in a more clear-minded way. And I don't even like to Trojan horse ritual with like, you're gonna get something like that out of it. Like you're gonna like, the gods are gonna like you better, or your brain's gonna work, whatever it is. Though those things might also be true. But whatever it is, it's something that is, it's like when you first start a practice and you get over the original kind of awkwardness of it, of like, what am I doing? I'm doing this. I'm lighting this thing. I'm facing east. What am I doing? Once you get over that, you find that you develop this like taste for it. Like it's this thing that you unlocked in yourself that feels like, if you're not doing it, I'm not feeding this sacred sense, and the irony is, of course, and this is another through line I really wanted to bring into this conversation, is that there's this whole epidemic of what could be called like a soul sickness, like that we're trying to wrap in this like DSM-5 or whatever. I don't even know what edition of the DSM they're on, to be honest with you. um, but in psychological, pathological language. But so many people, um, yourself included, from what I've gleaned, see the truth underneath all of that is that there's something deeply unfed in the human soul, and that lack is manifesting in all of these ways, and personal levels, societal levels. And in my experience, ritual really helps you get at nebulous things like that too. So there's just there's this, I don't know, this basic sort of human need that bringing ritual into your life seems to feed.
Right. I mean, patients come to me in my practice and like they, feel alienated from the religious upbringing of their childhood. But they're longing. They are longing for to have some kind of spiritual experience in their lives. And so it's so helpful to talk with them about things that they could do because they're totally open to it. They just have no idea how to go about it. Like they could set up a little altar in a corner of their room that reminds them of this kind of sacred soul aspect of themselves. Because just as you said, there's like a kind of sickness when it's missing, when the sacred aspect is missing. And I mean, in cultures all over the world, people um, do ritual and they pray and they have, you know, gratitude and have an idea of the sacredness of service. But in our culture, that somehow has gotten like devalued or denied
Yeah.
with, a very deleterious effect of alienation and loneliness and depression and anxiety and disconnection, fear.
Yeah, and it seems like it only becomes of interest to the power holders if you can show that it's got some kind of like capitalistic facing benefit, right? Like, oh, you mean it's going to up productivity if we bring mindfulness into the office, or it's going to if we have a yoga teacher come in once a month or something, people are going to be less likely to call in sick or something like that. And in one sense I get that because it's, you have a business, that's your interest if you're in charge of a company.
But it's no
But
focus on the sacred
no,
aspect of those practices.
that's 100% true. And that, yeah, and that's where I was going with it is like,
I mean, mindfulness is like hygiene and brushing your teeth,
right,
which is so,
absolutely.
it's missing so much to frame it like that.
Yes. Yeah, my friend Miles Neal, who's a psychologist who has spent, I think, a couple decades now in a Tibetan Buddhist um, lay lineage. He calls that McMindfulness. This sort of like this commoditized approach to productivity hacking or whatever. And yeah, I'm curious to like, what do you? This is something I've been thinking a lot about lately because the rabbit hole that's drawn me in the deepest, I think, in decades is I started to do a deeper dive into uh, Neoplatonism, especially, but the whole kind of Platonic, uh, you know, Greek lineage of thinkers. And are you familiar with Plotinus at all?
Yes, I have a quote from him in the beginning of my book.
Oh, perfect. What was the quote? I must have missed that.
It's the stars are like letters that inscribe themselves in the sky. Everything is connected. Everything breathes together.
Ooh, yeah, yeah, everything breathes together. Yes, yes, I remember that one. I remember that one. He draws this incredibly intimate link between going inward and going upward. Like the path of the soul's ascent really is this inward facing commitment. And for him, and maybe this is where you might disagree to some extent, for him, it really is about minimizing your relationship with the outer world, with the ego, and really deepening your relationship with the inner world. Because to him, the thing that was more ontologically real was the inner world and all of the beauty that you can find there. And as someone who's done, you know, a fair bit of meditation, I'm an on again, off again meditator. I have been for years. I've had very powerful inward facing experiences through psychedelics and things like that. But I don't think I've ever achieved what he seems to be pointing to in terms of this experience of like, there's something so beautiful that you can find through just withdrawing the senses that just like dwarfs everything in the outer world.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if you...
I don't resonate with that.
Interesting. Okay.
I don't resonate with that. Like, I mean, not that it doesn't have value too, but I really resonate with like the divinity, like in nature.
Yeah.
And the divinity in ourselves and in other people. You know, like the real, like the ordinary magic.
Mm-hmm.
Like what's like really divine in the everyday experience, and trying to tune into that, you know, rather than withdrawing from the outer world and the body.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's an especially important point, because we're living in a time where people already have this tendency to withdraw from the outer world. And, you know,
and to devalue
yeah,
it, make
right.
it, you know, a resource, exploit it. There's nothing there to honor.
Right. Very, very true. Very, very true. And as much as I love him, and I do think he's right about many, many things, he absolutely puts matter at the very, very, very bottom of the ontological chain. Like matter is an illusion. Matter is like an empty reflection of these higher realities, while at the same time though carrying a signature of those higher realities. And I
Well,
think
that's
go ahead.
like a Platonic ideal, you know,
Right.
like
Yes.
there's like the form. I mean, there's like it's like a, you know, like if I'm remembering, I was a philosophy major in college. If I'm
Oh, cool.
remembering, you know, like in Plato's Republic,
Mm-hmm.
he made this argument, which I know there's a reading of it to see it as like ironic, but that like artists were like, their work was really like sort of debased or devalued because that they were kind of referring to the form. The form itself was the ideal, and then whatever you would do was sort of derivative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that it was like not as valuable as the form itself.
Yes, and I 100% think that you are right with what you're alluding to with the irony, because I think Plato was trying to say in that statement, like, look, me writing this as the writer, as the artist, if you're too focused on what I'm writing and you're not looking to what it's the finger pointing at the moon thing, right? Like if you're obsessed with this writing and you're looking at the finger, you're not paying attention to like what I'm really trying to point to. So I do think he's being ironic in that sense, but I also do think he was being critical of certain kinds of art. We don't have to get into all of this because this is not.
He said artists should be expelled from the ideal republic.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But so Plato's. So this is something I'm in the midst of the most research I've ever done for a video, and it's going to be a video on the cave allegory, actually,
Mm-hmm.
which comes from the Republic. And the thing that I think so many people, because there's so many things, but that are, if you take them literally in the Republic, are so objectionable by today's standards, right? I mean, like separating children from the mothers, and like, just there's so many like incredibly, I mean, the noble lie, like lying to the society for the good, the ultimate good, and caste systems and all of these things, if you take them
Philosopher
literally.
King.
Right, philosopher king. Um, though I think, again, you could probably debate that would be a better setup than what we have going on here right now. But right at the beginning, Socrates says, like, they set out trying to talk about the ideal soul, and he's like, oh, this is so hypothetical, and so it relies on so many non physical things and assumptions. So why don't we just talk about the ideal city state? So the sort of thing that a lot of people skip over is, like, they're really talking about the soul. They're not talking about like a literal city state. They're talking about, how does one work on themselves, organize themselves? How did they find truth? How did they find um, purpose, divinity, all of those things? Uh, yeah, this isn't the direction I imagined we would go, but I'm happy. I'm happy to go here, because I'm sure you have many thoughts on what that entails. The sort of, and really, in some ways, that's what the first chapter of your book is about. This reclaiming of the multidimensional way of being. That there are these multifaceted kinds of health. It's
Right. And to give people ideas about literally things that they can do to feel more connected and to tune into that aspect of themselves, and that healing needs that. Like, you can't just focus upon the personality self and the kind of effects of growing up in our families and the difficulties with attachments or trauma, or we can't just focus upon our physical well-being. That all of it is essential to a holistic approach to healing.
Yeah. I'm curious, because you said your practice sort of underwent a metamorphosis, that into your 40s you kind of practiced pretty standard psychoanalysis. What are some of the Are there any examples of patients that you can share, without breaking confidentiality, of some of these other modalities and ways of thinking about the self that really have profound effects on people, um, in ways that you just could not get to through standard Western medical psychoanalytic approach?
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, what immediately came to mind is probably not what you're asking me, but like, I know so much more now than I did then.
Hmm.
And there was a patient who I saw who, like, she literally hated to eat food
Hmm.
because every time she would eat, her stomach hurt. And I had no idea what was going on, but now, because of the things that I've learned, I know about something called mast cell activation. And I'm sure that that is what she was experiencing. But because I didn't have that model, I couldn't really help her with it. I tried to, do things that I knew how to do. Like, I also have another quote in the beginning of my book by Maya Angelou that says, I did then what I knew how to do. Now that I know better, I do better.
Right.
You know, so now I would know what to try that could be helpful. Um, I mean, there's like, I recommend for everybody, almost everybody, that they do these practices that are brain retraining and limbic system retraining,
Hmm.
because all of us are, you know, given what's going on in the world and the news cycle and our awareness of the collapse of the environment and the ways in which, it's all the toxicity in the environment, where we're all in this state of chronic fight or flight.
Yeah.
And um, for many people, that is just at the heart of why their health is so eroded. And if you can help a person establish a sense of safety in their body, and I mean, that has to do with doing like physical practices, but I think it also has to do with having like a spiritual perspective, that having some kind of feeling of trust and
Yeah.
surrender. I mean, I feel more able to help people now than I ever have because of all the different tools that I've acquired. I mean, you can talk till the cows come home with somebody about what went on in their family growing up. And if they're in a state of like limbic system activation and mast cell, activation, they're just going to continue to feel anxious.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's something underneath what they're telling you, right? It's like
Hmm.
some way of being that's like taken hold of them that they're not even probably really conscious of. It's just
No, it's
become
on a cellular
habitual.
level.
Yeah. Tell me more about this. I'm not sure. I would love to hear more about the brain retraining too and the limbic system retraining, but I'm not really familiar with the mast cell activation either.
Well, mast cell activation is so common, and it's not something that is conventionally recognized by, most primary care doctors. Or um, the mast cells are a part of the immune system. They're white cells,
Hmm.
and we all have them all over our bodies, and they're a part of the immune response. So if there's some kind of pathogen or invader or toxin, the mast cells come and they have these like vesicles in them that have these bioactive substances in them, and they release their substances and they neutralize um, the pathogen or the invader, and that's when they're functioning well. But we have them like in the highest concentration in our bodies, where our body interfaces with the environment. So like in our lungs where we
Mm.
exchange air, or in our gut where we take in food. And sometimes the mast cells, when a person is, especially when a person is dysregulated and their limbic system is dysregulated, they're in a constant state of hyperarousal, the mast cells just release their substances like in this very chaotic way. And one of the primary substances that they release is histamine. And it can create all of these symptoms. People can have, anxiety, they can have depression, they can have brain fog, they can have insomnia, they can have, digestive issues, sinus issues. I mean, every organ system can be affected because we have mast cells all over our bodies.
Hmm. Hmm.
And when a person who's having like significant mast cell activation goes to see a conventional MD, like very often they're complaining of symptoms in so many different organ systems that it doesn't really make sense to the practitioner. And they'll say, I think you're really stressed. I think you really should see a psychiatrist. And so then they go see a psychiatrist and they're prescribed an antidepressant or an anti anxiety medicine. And that's not the issue. They have mast cell activation. And they may be experiencing anxiety, but it's not, the treatment would not be optimally to give them an antidepressant, but rather to give them, supplements that stabilize the mast cells.
Mm. Very interesting. So it's sort of like this way of being that's hyper aroused and stressed, and then it's almost like the underlying physiology and biology is like stuck in this state as if it's
Stuck.
fighting off
It's
an
stuck.
invader when it
It's
doesn't
in
need
a
to. Yeah.
stuck. It's and a lot of people, they don't even realize that they're in a state of chronic stress. This is just how they feel normally, but their body really is stressed, and they are having like food sensitivities, or they can't tolerate supplements, or um, they have insomnia, or
Is there testing you can do to confirm that someone is in this state?
Well, there is, I mean, there's a hematologist, a doctor who's written a book that's like this fat that's called Never Bet Against Occam. And his name is Dr. Larry Afrin. He's a very brilliant man, but he like wishes to do like testing to confirm mast cell activation. And like these tests are very specialized and they need to be handled in a very specific way. And often the laboratory doesn't handle the tests properly and the results are not accurate and reliable. I have a mentor whose name is Dr. Neil Nathan. And what I learned from him is that it's a clinical diagnosis. You know, you
Mm-hmm.
can ask questions, and if a person is reporting symptoms in, multiple different organ systems, that you can make the diagnosis without, having like confirmatory lab tests. And then you can, prescribe the limbic system retraining and the brain retraining and the appropriate supplements. And then you can see if they're going to respond to that. Also, um, the way that I was trained is that, mast cell activation can occur because a person has mold toxicity, because a person has chronic Lyme disease, because they have chronic Epstein-Barr, because they were in a car accident, or because they had a head injury. It can occur for many, many different
Mm-hmm.
reasons. It can occur because, they went through a horrendous divorce or they have long COVID. It can occur for a million reasons. And the way that I was trained is to look for the underlying cause. So I would not stop with just diagnosing mast cell activation and treating it. I would check to see if potentially they have mold toxicity, because that's something that can also be treated. And it's diagnosed with a urine test. So that's also an extremely common cause of physical symptoms in my psychiatric practice.
Wow, interesting. So tell me more about the brain retrainment. What do you prescribe for that? Because I'm sure so many people, myself included, watching or listening, their attention system is not in good order. They're so used to just fast bursts of, again, like bashing the dopamine system over and over and over again all day long, getting stuck in just habitual scrolling, which gets you stuck in. I was just talking to a close friend on the show too about like the close relationship between rumination and all kinds of pathological and psychological um, issues. Yet we're all doing that all the time on a daily basis. So I'm assuming that that probably comes into play, like retraining your habits with devices. But yeah,
Exactly,
tell me
exactly.
more.
So there's different programs. I've sort of sequentially, I used to recommend one, now then I would recommend a different one, and now I'm newly recommending a third one. Each one seems to me an improvement on the previous one. So I initially recommended dynamic neural retraining system. Then I recommended something called the Gupta program,
Hmm.
and now I'm recommending something called primal trust.
Hmm.
And they essentially all do the same thing. They all do brain retraining, although the primal trust also has a lot of like the brain retraining is kind of from the brain down, like working on the body. The
Yeah.
trust has the brain down, but it also has from the body up, like with
Hmm.
practices that tonify the vagus nerve and somatic experiencing kinds of therapies. But they're all programs that are downloaded from the internet, and you pay a fee, and then you have access to videos that you can learn about the science of what is going on physically, and also learn practices to do. Like the Gupta program has all of these meditations, guided meditations that one can do. And the Gupta program has like a recommendation that you identify um, certain thoughts that repetitively trouble you. So, like, let's say somebody has chronic illness and they feel awful. They say, "Oh my God, like I'm never going to get better," something like that, or um, I feel so bad that I'm not able to, show up as a um, good wife and mother because I feel so sick, or
Mhm.
whatever the chronic thought is. So you identify those particular thoughts, and then he recommends a certain kind of ritual that you do to stop those thoughts and instead replace them with something that is like calming to the nervous system. So when I was recommending the Gupta program to everyone, um, like I was integrating it with patients who would do ketamine with me,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
ketamine assisted psychotherapy. And like sometimes when people, like, you want to replace those like thoughts of stress and rumination and self-criticism and things that make you feel bad with something positive. So like with like for some people with the ketamine, they have incredibly heart-opening experiences and they just
Yeah.
incredible sense of well-being. So they can remember that state and replace the uh, ruminative, self-critical thoughts with that, or it could be a memory of when you felt really healthy and were just really enjoying being in your body. um, so it's a process of kind of identifying awareness of what you're doing and replacing it with something that is more uplifting, like it's creating different patterns. And it's like it's like neural retraining.
Yeah, there's a word that comes to mind. Did you ever read any Robert Anton Wilson growing up?
No.
Oh, I think you'd like him. He's very playful and trickstery and talks a lot about like one of his most famous riffs is this whole riff on reality tunnels and the idea that everybody's living in their own um sort of constantly under construction and culturally inherited, familially inherited, all all these different things that culminated into this thing that he called a reality tunnel. And then um he talks about the importance of changing and expanding your reality tunnel and doing what he calls meta programming. And what you're talking about kind of reminds me of like therapeutic meta programming. It's that there are certain practices you can do. And for him, psychedelics were often involved, but he did other things too. Um, he got very into like Western esotericism and uh, like meditative practices and magical practices and stuff. But he always maintained this sort of like, I don't know what's real. I'm just going to try the stuff and like take it very seriously without necessarily taking it seriously. Like taking like I believe this now. Um, but yeah, that I love that idea of meta programming. That there's this sort of multi-dimensional sense of self and sense of the world that you have, and that you can get behind that with some of these practices. And it makes a lot of sense that ketamine would be a really important tool for getting underneath your ego and your sense of self, and your unconscious behavior patterns. Do you know if I know some psychedelics have seem to have this um, effect of increased neuroplasticity
Oh
and
yeah, ketamine
potentially, yeah.
definitely does that. It definitely increases neuroplasticity. That's one of the ways that it works. And like when patients want to do it with me, I say, please, like after we do the session, please don't start doom scrolling or watch
Right, yeah.
some, you know, movie that's about, nuclear holocaust, like be very mindful about the inputs that you expose yourself to afterwards, because your brain is in this very neuroplastic state and you can take advantage of it. Go spend time in beautiful nature or journal or do more of what you want to have more of in your life. Let's say you want more music in your life, like listen to music, make art, do things that um, uplift you.
Yeah, that's so important. And that's one of the things in my experience that's always been challenging. A few years ago, I did an ayahuasca retreat where I went to Peru, stayed there multiple sessions, but then going home is just like this weird it almost just makes it feel like a dream you had, like an incredibly powerful, harrowing, life altering dream. But it just like kind of, it did have I don't want to say it didn't have lasting benefits, because it definitely did, but it also fades, it just kind of like slowly fades. And I think that word you used earlier, hygiene, is really good, because I think that applies with these things too. Like maybe, it's not brushing your teeth twice a day level hygiene, but it might be a couple times a year. It might be every quarter or yearly or whatever it is. But yeah, that integration step, people love to say integration. Like they love to say, you know, how are you integrating? But I think that's one of those words kind of like ritual, where and I think those two concepts are probably pretty closely linked now that I think about it. But it's a word people love to say, but I think most people don't know what integration means or how you do it. So I would love to hear you riff on integration, because that's one of those
Well,
things that I
it's
think is so
interesting,
important.
like I've been doing this training in psychedelic medicine, and we had our second training session. They were like a couple of months apart, and the leader wanted each of us to talk about um, like what we had. The training is both, didactic and experiential,
Hmm.
and the leader wanted us to talk about what we had um, learned in our previous journey, and how had we been living our, he called it divine deployment,
Hmm.
so like some kind of attention, like, okay, like you um, had this experience, and how has it been playing out for you? How
Right.
have you changed? In what way are you um, making use of that insight? Or was it just an insight that you had during the journey? Like my insight was that the world didn't need my grief. The
Ooh.
world my um, needed my effervescence.
Mm.
And I couldn't really, I remembered that that was my insight, but I couldn't really honestly say that I had done a great job of being more effervescent since the
Yeah.
last time,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. For sure. Yeah, and sometimes you get these insights that are so meta that it's like, what am I supposed to do with this? Like I've definitely had some pretty planetary, cosmic, one of the cliche things obviously is that you connect to to the great mother, or like the spirit of earth or whatever. And I've had that experience, in the sense that it's almost like mom is reminding you what you're supposed to be doing here as a species, kind of thing, and you're kind of fucking it up. Like you're destroying nature. You're forgetting that there's like this innate spirit, this force in everything, and that you came out of that same thing, and that you came out of it for a specific reason, so that you can be a steward of it, and you can help, spread the light and warmth further beyond the planet, and also take care of this one. And you're not do and it's like, okay, but what do I, you feel almost like, what am I
Well,
supposed to
but I
do?
mean, I would say that, and maybe it doesn't feel legitimate to you, but I mean, to me, the conversations that you're having with people are raising consciousness. And um, I would think that people listening to you, that they would feel inspired to be better citizens of the earth through
I hope
listening
so.
to the conversations that you have with your guests.
I hope so. I truly, humbly hope so. Though I'd be absolutely lying if I said that it wasn't enjoyable for me, and that I wasn't getting
Well, that's not
something out of
mutually
it.
exclusive. Like, why shouldn't it be enjoyable for you? If it's enjoyable for you, does that mean that it's not like like a good deed? I don't
Well,
agree with that.
I thank you. I thank you, and I hope that is the case for sure. I'm curious. So, unfortunate on an unfortunate note, did you see that the? I'm not sure which approval it was, but um, an FDA panel struck down one of the main. Was it the final step before MDMA
Well,
legalization?
it was is an advisory panel. I've been following this, and I was kind of shocked because I had been fully expecting, given what I had been hearing from the, MAPS, which is the
Yeah,
Organization Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, that this was sort of going to be approved by August, and not so fast,
yeah,
and it seemed like they were. Saying that they didn't I mean, some of it just seemed like kind of ridiculous to me. Like, one of the criticisms was that the study wasn't double blinded. Well, how could it be double blinded? Because the participants would obviously know if they had a
right.
psychedelic experience. I don't understand how they could require that. Like, that doesn't make sense to me. But that was one of the faults found with the study.
Hmm.
Um, the I don't understand that. So that was one of the criticisms. I think they found fault with another thing that they said was that they weren't used to assessing psychotherapy, which was part of the therapeutic modality along with
Hmm.
the MDMA, so that they're not used to like approving things that have to do with therapy. Like, that didn't make sense to me either.
Hmm.
Like, that's what it is. It was MDMA plus therapy as a healing modality. I mean, one person who I heard talking about it said that they felt like it was the concerns raised were legitimate, and that this was not the last word on it, and that this would continue to be um, upgraded and worked on. But to me, it's like, okay, I don't have like, the double blind placebo controlled all the research studies, but anecdotally, in a huge body of anecdotal evidence of people feeling as though that this had helped them with symptoms of post traumatic stress disorder in a way that nothing else had.
Yeah.
So it's to me, like these antipsychotic medications that um, are so blunting of consciousness and have such deleterious effects on people long term, even though, for some people, that's all that allows them to kind of function without being violent or harming themselves. Okay. But, the overuse of antidepressants and the way that antidepressants get approved, and like all the medicines that are so addictive and that have such serious withdrawal syndromes, and they're all like approved, and then MDMA is somehow not.
Yeah. 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 And for people who haven't been following this, this is, this has been going on for decades at this point. Rick Doblin, the guy who founded Maps, he's been working on this above board, going through all the FDA approval steps, privately funded by people who are donating. Um, and it's been going so well that they've been rushed through the approval process and every step. And this is the first major um, failing that I've seen or that I've heard. It just seems like it's happening faster and faster and faster. And even me, as someone who, like, yeah, I'm somewhat of a bard for that sings in praise of these things. But I have to say that even I've been shocked. So I went to their they had a huge conference last year, Maps did,
Yeah.
and I got invited to that, and I was absolutely shocked at how massive it was. I mean, this was like over 10,000 people, tons of businesses, hundreds of speakers, just massive. Like, it really felt like this is a victory lap for everything, for this whole community, for everything they've been fighting for. So many people, by the way, with like PhD, MD on their name tags that I would see walking around. Um, And it was just this massive mixing of, you know, people who are like artists in that culture, people like me who are like sort of, I guess I'm like on the periphery of it, but I talk about psychedelics a lot, so I'm there. And then there's practitioners there, and policy making people and entrepreneurs and all of this stuff. And it was, of course, anything big, there's criticisms, but overall, I felt like it was such a beautiful, positive, fun experience. And I'm a little bit shocked, honestly, that now we're at this impasse where I'm not really sure what it means yet, or how, you know, big of a setback this is. But it does worry me for all those reasons you said and more. Um,
I was shocked.
yeah.
I mean, I had been felt like I had been led to believe that this was like kind of a done deal.
hmm Yeah, and the thing that worries me is, like, you know, it was seen kind of like, well, MDMA, it's not a classical psychedelic, it's not a tryptamine, it's not as difficult of an experience as some of these others can be. So, but it sets a good tone. And then psilocybin will be right after that. And then we'll kind of like have this ball rolling. And now now this is kind of seemingly under threat. And I do a quick aside, like I do want to address this because anytime psychedelics are brought up in a significant way lately, and I think this is because the YouTube audience has been growing, I get I get this really violent knee jerk reaction that's some flavor of drugs are bad, right? Because they're so indoctrinated and brainwashed into thinking, believing whatever they were told by the policeman at their school when they were in like second grade, right? That like these things are going to like mutate your chromosomes and stay in your spine forever and like rot your brain or whatever it is. And I would just like to hear from you, who is rigorously trained. um,
I think that these medicines need to be administered in a ceremonial and sacred way. Like I am not. I mean, I feel the same about alcohol. You know, like if you're going to change your consciousness, I'd like it to be done in a sacred and ceremonial way or a celebratory way, and not just simply get high. Um, as far as I understand, their MDMA is not dangerous. It's not addictive. It's not. Um, there's not like um, physiological danger with it. Um, you know, there. I don't think it's the case with MDMA, but I have witnessed with psilocybin that people can have like very seriously traumatizing experiences. And it's not the rule, but it can happen. And I think these medicines need to be treated with a lot of respect for how powerful they are.
yep.
And, you know, like there's some kind of, in a way, it's like a sort of faith, it seems, in the psychedelic community that everybody gets the journey that they're meant to have and that there's some kind of psychospiritual reason for them having a particular type of journey. But like, I've witnessed like people having like very seriously traumatizing trips with psilocybin. And it remains to be seen, you know, how they're going to integrate that. And um, is it ultimately going to be framed and experienced as therapeutic? You know, or, you know, is it like a public health thing? Like most people are not going to have this kind of
Yeah.
bad thing happen. But I don't think I mean, for me, the jury is out. Like, I think bad things can happen,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure that I can get behind that ultimately it's all for the good. Like maybe that would have been better for that person not to have had that experience.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm totally hear what you're saying, even as someone who thinks that these things should be available to people who want them. And I think the idea, the cartoonish idea of healing that some people have, like it's only going to make me feel good, right? Well, I mean, if that's really the approach that we're taking, we got to throw all of Jung out the window. We got to throw all of the sort of like what I think a lot of people, what I think is traumatizing to a lot of people is also potentially the thing that is the most powerful, potent archetypal experience that a person can have, which is, what all of these ancient mystery traditions were based around, which is an experience of a kind of death and a rebirth, like a kind of reality as you saw it before this experience is not the same as the reality you see post that initiation. And there's a lot of circumstantial and even hard evidence to suggest that a lot of these initiations probably used some kind of psychoactive
Yes,
compound. But whether they did or they didn't, that is the experience that you're signing up for when you take a strong dose of something like psilocybin. And a, a lot of people aren't going to tell you like, hey, you're going to go into whatever words are about to come out of my mouth. It's not going to do it justice. You're about to go into some kind of psychospiritual experience where the way you experience your thoughts is not going to be linear and normal. Your perception of reality is not going to be linear and normal. You may be confronted by the reality of your mortality in a way that you cannot avoid. Things that you're avoiding that traumatize you might come right to the front of your awareness, and you're not going to be able to get rid of them. And in a sense, that can for sure be traumatizing, but it also puts you in that state where, I mean, you must know this as a practitioner, that you've got to get your patient into a state where they're comfortable enough to do that, where they're comfortable enough to bring this tormenting thing to the front of their own mind and deal with it in a way that feels real and feels substantial and not theoretical. And that's the space that these things will get you into. And if you're not ready to deal with them in that way, it might not be time for you to do it. But it sure would be good to have them at your disposal when you are ready. I mean, that's my 2 cents at least.
I can agree with that.
Are you able to say, I know obviously with your being a licensed clinician, it's sort of a touchy subject, but are you able to say what the training that you're doing is, or is that
I can't say I
okay?
can't say what it is, and I'm not, going to offer it in my practice until, the it's legal. Ketamine is legal.
Yeah.
You can prescribe ketamine, and I'm doing this training for my own like personal growth, and also with the hope that um, one day it will be legal, and that I will be have like special training to be able to offer it most skillfully. Um,
That alone is so sad to me. That like that alone, that we're in this crazy position where a responsible, highly educated person is not able to say things like that is sad to me.
yeah,
The other thing that I worry about with these things is, to your point, what's being legalized is it's kind of a whole suite, right? It's like it's the substance along with a particular setting, approach to the therapy, right? And do you worry that that may not be the ideal way to approach things?
I absolutely do. Like the model they have is with two therapists. I mean, that's completely not practical.
Hmm.
It would not be practical for me in my practice to have a second therapist. I don't feel like it's necessary at all. And also, this is a little bit of a side point, but I get these different medical newsletters, and they were reporting upon some kind of LSD variant that was like extremely helpful for anxiety. But they
Hmm.
were complaining that the side effects of it were like hallucinations.
Right. Yeah.
And so that they were like trying to extract like the psychedelic effect of
Yeah.
it, which is
Yeah.
to me so misguided and so kind of crazy, you know?
Yes, they have it backwards. The anxiety reduction is the side effect of the psychospiritual
Yeah.
enormity and transformation that occurred. It's like, well, what if we could just get rid of that and have just a
Right.
reduction? Yeah, I think that's silly too.
It's amazing. So
Yes,
wild.
yes. And the other thing, obviously, that and this actually became a bit of a controversy in it, not directly, but in a sort of minor way. And when I say minor, I'm not saying that this is a minor point, because it's not a minor point, but it was minor to the overall experience of that whole conference I went to. But there were some people from indigenous lineages that,
I saw
yeah,
a video of that.
yeah, and
Highly critical.
yeah, and I have sympathy for them, but I also have sympathy for maps, because it's like, you've invested all this time and energy and grown this thing, and you have this specific goal of trying to get these things decriminalized and get them so they can be brought back into society in a responsible way. But then, just by being a big engine of that, now you have all these other, you're absorbing all these other expectations, and you're absorbing all these other, well, what about this, what about that, what about us, what about our tradition? And it's like, I agree that all those things are super important, and that you should be able to do those things, and you should have a voice. But then on the flip side, I'm like, but is maps, is it their responsibility? And they've kudos to them. They've clearly like taken it on now as part of their um responsibility. But it just goes to show, like, I think that the giant thing underneath all of this is just like, it shouldn't be illegal in the first place. It
It
shouldn't
should
be.
not be
Yeah.
illegal. MDMA is so helpful and so heart opening and um, it's such a, it offers people so much possibility of having compassion for themselves and so much acceptance. And it makes no sense that it's illegal.
Yeah. Yeah, and in a lot of ways, I think this kind of brings us full circle a little bit in how we started the conversation, in terms of this, like, the importance of these multiple ways of knowing and operating. Because if you, Judy, hadn't done this like self-directed deep dive into spirituality and archetypes and Jung and indigenous wisdom and Chinese medicine and all these other things we haven't even talked about, if you didn't do that, you would be far less prepared to guide through people through like experiences like these. Like, if you only had the Western medical uh way,
Personality.
yeah, way of seeing, and someone's telling you that they feel like they're being confronted by what feels like a god or something, like, what language do you have to help someone with that at that point? I'm wondering how you bring some of that into those ketamine experiences, if you can share any of that, because it's,
I always
yeah.
do it like in this sacred and ceremonial way, like in the beginning, like setting up an altar, and asking my patient to bring in things for an altar. And I provide things to the altar too that seem to me in some kind of way meaningful to what's on their mind and how I know
Mm,
them, or what kind of energy would be supportive. And then, I do like a ceremony where I call in the directions, and I um, call in the ancestors and the spirit guides and ask them if there's any particular ancestors of their own or spirit guides of their own that they would like to invite in. And then we have like, beautiful music. And um, I use lozenges, so
Okay.
it's not IV. So it's very much like not medicalized, and like you try to find the sweet spot where the dose is the right dose, so that they're really significantly altered, but also can still converse. I mean, some people don't want to converse, they just want to go inside, but it can be useful to converse. And then I'll keep notes about what we talk about, um, as the person is journeying, and they wear an eye shade. And so, I mean, and oh, before we get started, I often invite them, if they would like to draw an oracle card. I love
Oh,
to
cool.
use the oracle cards. So I have all kinds of different decks, and I ask them, what do they resonate most with? Would they like to pull a card from an animal deck, or a tree deck, or a divine feminine deck? I have all kinds of different decks. And I have this wonderful little um,
Do you,
receptacle that's filled with earth from this place in New Mexico. That New Mexico is called Santuario de Chinmayo.
mm,
It's this healing place where there's a, a chapel and all of these braces and casts and shoes that have been left there from people who were healed.
oh,
So I
wow.
have this earth from that place, and so it's done in a very sacred healing way. It's not like, there's the ketamine clinics have sprung up all over the
Yeah.
place where
Yeah.
people are given IV ketamine at high doses, no attention paid to set or setting, no work done, subsequently to have a conversation about what happened, in the journey, and to, make sense of it. Um,
Yeah.
so,
That would, man, that would open such an that'd be such an ontological landmine for a lot of people, just having to deal with the unbelievable experiences that can happen in psychedelic states and having no context or guidance. Like, I could see that being hugely disruptive in both positive and negative ways, I guess. Oh, I'm remembering now, in your book you mentioned that you often couple parts work or parts therapy, IFS, um, with ketamine. And I think that's really interesting because, well, could you give an overview of IFS and what the
well,
general philosophy is?
so, um, in contrast to like conventional psychology, there's an idea of a core self, um, that has attributes that are, spiritual attributes. So I can't remember. There's like the 8 P's and the 5 C's, but they're all different like qualities of being. And so, like, there may be like a a part of the self that, a person rejects, like
Yeah.
some, aspect of themselves that is vulnerable, that they feel is shameful. So, um, you might invite that part in and have a conversation with that part of the self. Um, so, I mean, that I did a training when I did my ketamine training. That was like part of it.
Yeah, I talked to Richard Schwartz years ago at this point. So I've done this podcast far before it was video. And there's like a whole, you know, 300 plus episodes that are just audio. And he was one of those episodes, and we did just a couple light exercises during the conversation. Um, but yeah, I know that exiled parts, that's what he calls them, right? Like these parts of yourself that for whatever reason you've the idea is that you sort of incarnate these parts of your psyche, and you give them names, and you try to figure out what they want and what
And how they helped you,
yeah,
how they were trying to protect you and serve you.
Yes.
but that maybe no longer it's adaptive.
Right. Yeah, these exiled parts you're talking about, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. And then there's like these so yeah, the IFS stands for internal family systems, and it's this idea that that there's not just one part of you. There's all these different competing sort of personalities and archetypes and desires within you. It's very kind of Jungian in some ways. Um
And
and
very
that they
close to our
yeah.
experience, like we all experience that we have different parts of ourselves, that there's different voices in our head. One person says this thing, another person feels a different way about it. Another part feels a different way about it. um,
Yeah. Yes, and I haven't had any like real, therapy done in that way, but it does sound interesting, and it definitely sounds interesting with the addition of something like ketamine. I'm curious because I've never done a ketamine treatment. You said some people like to be quiet and just go inward. Some people talk a lot. Um, what is like the rough balance of that? Do because
Many people like to talk. Many
yeah,
people like to
okay.
talk. And also, like, people have very, very different experiences. Like I've and it's been the minority, but it's definitely something that I've experienced where people access like tremendous grief,
Wow.
and they really are um like very, very sad and in quite a bit of pain, emotional pain about things. The other people are in like states of bliss. It's not necessarily predictable like what a person is going to experience. And it's kind of like a wild card, like you don't know what what's going to happen, and it can be different from time to time as well. And it's not like, okay, a person weighs this much and they're this age, so this
Yeah.
is the right dose. Like it's very individual in terms of people have different sensitivities to it. So like a little light person could need a big dose that they just but it has a very huge margin of safety. Like it's used in pediatric anesthesiology. It doesn't suppress the respiratory system. It's very, very safe, um, and short acting.
Hmm.
Like the whole thing from the time the patient arrives to when they leave is like 3 hours. For the
Yeah.
whole journey, whereas MDMA or psilocybin is a much longer
Yes.
journey.
Yes. Yeah, on that note of dosing, I saw that firsthand in such an in the most insane way I've ever seen it in my life on that ayahuasca retreat, because what they called the starter dose absolutely leveled me and was like the most intense, right up there with the most intense heroic dose experiences I've ever had. And then I saw women who were smaller than me have like almost no
Right.
reaction and
Right.
just like take double that. And
Yeah.
um some
It
people
has
had
to
no
do.
visions. Yeah, it's nuts.
And I think like I've seen people. I've had the same experience with other medicines. That 200 milligrams of MDMA didn't touch somebody. 7 grams of psilocybin didn't touch somebody. You
Wow.
know, and yet another person 2.5 grams was huge.
This is reminding me, have you by chance seen Richard Harness was in a documentary called Changing
Oh
of the
yes, I
Gods?
watched the whole thing.
Yeah, I've only seen the first episode, but um and this is a pretty crazy level of for some people. But he talked about, because he was friends with Stan Groff in the early
Right.
days of like pre-illegal, pre-LSD becoming illegal. Um, for people that don't know, they were a lot of psychologists were using LSD and psilocybin
And
as
MDMA.
and MDMA as powerful.
Couples therapy
Yeah,
with
yeah,
MDMA. Very powerful.
yeah. And Tarnas was talking about exactly what you're describing, this being unable to discern, like, is this person going to go to the underworld, or is this person going to like have a blissful experience? Or and he was
But
actually saying that astrological
that was the highest
factors.
correlated thing, was the
Yeah.
astrology of what was going on. That was what was most highly correlated with the type of experience. Like if they were having a Pluto transit,
Yeah.
like that would be the most likely to have had a particular kind of effect. That was, I mean, they did personality profiles, everything. Nothing correlated as much as the astrological configurations in
Yeah.
terms of the predicting experience.
Do you, uh, how much have you heard about this, or have you looked into this or played with this yourself at all? 'Cause I want to ask him about this next time I talk to him for sure. Now that I'm thinking about it, because this is really really interesting. Because this could potentially be a way to at least prove something to yourself. At least like, okay, you think this is all nonsense?
I,
Well,
I have I
yeah.
have not. I mean, I don't have like the vast experience that he has with like administering it to multiple patients.
Hmm.
Like I have quite a bit of experience with ketamine. Um, I don't know. I don't know.
It's interesting. It's interesting stuff. This whole conversation has been really, really wonderful and truly,
Wide ranging.
yeah. But it always is. It always is, and it's got to be because you have such a wide breadth of interests and experience, um, and it's been really fun. You have a book out. Um, what else do you have going on?
I'm going to be the keynote speaker at a conference in Sedona that's in mid October. That's about spirituality, integrating spirituality into psychotherapy.
Beautiful. What's it called?
I think it's called Mind Body Spirit Conference or something like that.
Sounds about correct. Oh, I was going to ask you too. I would imagine you're familiar with her at least. Do you know Dr. Lisa Miller from Columbia?
That name rings a bell, but I'm not familiar with her work.
She has a book called The Awakened Brain that I think if you
Oh,
haven't,
yes, I
yeah.
have. I have heard her. I have heard her podcast. It's about spirituality and like cultivating spirituality um, in terms of brain. Yeah, she is wonderful.
Anything else you want to tell people about?
My book just won a Nautilus Award.
Ooh, congratulations.
Thank you. That's exciting.
It is. It is.